Hello, this is Dr. Scott Catino, and I'm putting forward this video lecture on the non-state soldier in history. The topic is obviously very important. The United States finds itself confronting these non-state soldiers. We call them insurgents or guerrilla groups. They all possess a variety of capabilities, and what they're not is a conventional military force relying on firepower and large formations to approach and attack the United States and its interests conventionally. They're the very opposite of that. So understanding what I call the three C's about these groups, their character, their context, and their capabilities, it's all very, very important. The United States, most likely into the near future, not having a peer competitor militarily, will continue to face insurgent groups, these non-state soldiers, as we have over the last several decades in Iraq and Afghanistan, and prior to that. So understanding some of the basics about these organizations throughout history is critically important. And what I hope to do by capturing some of these trends is to also sharpen an understanding of the boundaries and nature of these groups so that when service personnel, U.S. service personnel, enter the contemporary operational environment, they'll be more cognizant, more aware of the changes and characteristics that they face. This is obviously also important for our studies here at a graduate military level to begin to have a deeper view of these groups. Well, let's get into it right away. It's important that we understand, not only for the sake of this course on this very subject, but also for a clarification of definitions, to understand some basic terminology. And first, we need to start with the state. There was a time when there wasn't a state, prior to the rise of nation states that we see in history, and particularly in Europe in the 19th century and a bit before. Societies were ruled by a variety of types of governments and leaders, and I have several listed there. So we don't want to get too caught up in the notion of the state being, in essence, the mother of these groups, or a comparison or contrast to these groups. Because the fact of the matter is, this type of asymmetrical warfare has been waged since the beginning of time. Secondly, even though we call these groups non-state, that is true. They're not outwardly affiliated with a country or a nation. They're still often receiving support from states, from a nation, for a variety of very important reasons, because these groups are often very powerful and can serve the interest of the state. So we don't want to get too caught up in that. These groups, which are indeed not armies of a state, certainly are associated with nation states as they receive funding and cover different types of weapons and support. The third point is also critical in looking at this. Sometimes it's difficult either for students or to get a clear definition of where a terrorist group begins and where that type of organization, I should say, ends, and we see the emergence of these guerrilla force groups, these non-state soldiers. The fact of the matter is that when we look at these non-state soldiers, they differ from terrorist groups in that three general ways. Number one, who they are. They're often more organized. Their organizations are larger. Their capabilities are greater, and how they fight, the second area, is critical to understand. Their capabilities are higher, more advanced weaponry, higher levels of explosives, more complex tactics that they use. They don't simply use terrorist bombings and similar kidnappings, although that may be a part of what they do. We find these groups like the Haqqani Network, for interest, carrying out complex operations that are military in their complexity. And also who they target. Terrorist groups often target simply civilians because they are so-called soft targets, but you'll find the non-state soldier will target military forces in addition to civilians. Their capabilities are higher, they operate at a higher complexity, and their goals and aims therefore can be different. That's important to understand. They are certainly a different class from criminals, from the average small cell terrorist to rioters, protesters, etc. And we need to understand them in that context. Let's get right into it. The non-state soldier, for the sake of this course that we're teaching and similar courses in military studies, is the study of militant foreign ethnic religious groups not outwardly affiliated with a sovereign state. So let's keep a somewhat broad definition of our topic so we can cover so many diverse groups, like we see here with the Tamil Tigers and groups like the Haqqani, or groups that we see also outside of Afghanistan, so many terrorist groups and non-state soldiers that we saw in Iraq. What's the main objective of these non-state soldiers? Well, it's control of the state. Their goal is not necessarily to conquer land and take it over. It's the element of control, and it varies according to their political agenda. The destruction, the degradation, or defeat of the state. All of these are critical objectives. And by doing so, they can expand their political agenda, their control, their economics, and even their global reach. In this slide, it's important to bring out and get an initial sense of the historical changes that take place. Now, I want to be very careful here, and I have an asterisk at the bottom of this slide, that these time periods are arbitrary and capture, in essence, a general trend taking place. So this was not some period that was delineated from the other with a clear time frame that occurred over a few years. These periods blend somewhat together, and they're a bit fuzzy in their definition, but yet they are discernible trends and generalities that are critical to understand, to see the movement and momentum, as well as to understand the context of the non-state soldier in the modern era. So what are these periods that we're looking at? There's a pre-modern period, a period in the ancient world where we see these small groups, or even as they get into larger formations, operating against the state. And they're using the same asymmetrical tactics in general that we find even in the modern era. So we need to briefly look at that. With the rise of the nation state, and particularly in the 18th through the 20th century, we see these guerrilla groups, these insurgent groups, working alongside conventional armies. This is typical in the modern warfare of that era. We find large armies, conventional forces, and we see these paramilitary forces operating in conjunction, harassing their opponents, attacking, assassinating, interdicting communication lines, um, carrying out work that appears to be minor and secondary to the conventional forces, but yet is still significant. The third is an era of terrorism, and you see these periods overlap. These groups are terrorist small cell type groups, but yet they begin to form in larger groups, become more complex. The times begin to change, and their operations begin to change in complexity, in frequency, in communication. And there is a perfect example of where we see terrorism morphing into this higher level of warfare. So we'll look at the shifting context and capabilities of that era. The communist era, in the post-World War II era, is a period of the blossoming of communist revolutions. There are major changes in doctrines, sophistication, use of weapons, and even tactics, and phasing of operations and development of forces. This is critical to look at. And lastly, this modern era, which is certainly distinct from the communist era. And we'll see some of those distinctions and changes that take place and capture some of the capabilities and context of that. So these are the basic periods that we're going to look at, these 5 periods where there is some overlap, but yet the trend is indeed changing according to those 5 characteristics. There are common characteristics in all these periods, and I don't want to overstate differences. There are certainly characteristics that should be identifiable and understood at the graduate military studies level. First is survival, the survivability of these groups. These small groups seek to remain viable, and that means to live and survive. Avoidance of direct contact and conflict with superior forces is true in all of these ages. The second level, deception, the covert world of concealment and spying, is also critical for survival, for information, for operations. We find these smaller organized groups. We find these asymmetrical forces relying particularly upon this. And exploitation of the terrain. The use of terrain effectively in sanctuary operations and exfiltration is critical. What does that mean? In order to survive and to operate and to remain strong and to be able to defeat a superior force, they're going to rely on difficult terrain where large forces cannot effectively operate. They're going to rely on areas where they can hide, areas where they can move with less notice, areas where a government presence and reach and force is certainly not as concentrated. And these are some of the basics to understand. And the last point, leverage of the population. If these non-state soldiers then and now were able to use the population as a force multiplier and they foil against the enemy, then their possibility of success was exponentially greater. So using the population for development of effective networks of communication, supply, sanctuary, information, intelligence, and recruitment was and is critical in all the stages. So we need to see some of those basic characteristics. And if you're coming into this subject for the first time, if you walk away understanding that this is the essence of asymmetry, to be able to survive. And the common notion that is so often talked about in guerrilla warfare is that the opponent is defeated as long as the insurgent group simply survives. To create a long war and to rely on the covert world, these dark networks, exploiting terrain in the population, and combinations of those too, is certainly a part of this era of non-state soldiers in this modern warfare that we talk about. Okay, let's move into the next slide. Now, Sun Tzu is an extraordinary individual in military history, and many of you have heard of him or have read his work, The Art of War. And what makes Sun Tzu so extraordinary is certainly first his influence on the development of guerrilla warfare and even on modern developers and proponents of it like Mao Zedong. But particularly, this third point here is that in contrast to conventional military thinkers, either in the ancient or modern world, we find that Sun Tzu does not concentrate on the military force, the armed force itself, as the sole and primary instrument of force. He sees a psychological, an economic, an intelligence, information, and even a terrain and timing to be both instruments and dimensions to operate asymmetrically against his opponents. That's critical to understand. We find even in this ancient period, we have an extraordinary asymmetrical thinker, an extraordinary general here that conceptualized both the battle space in a multi-dimensional concept, as well as seeing these areas and weapons as being far broader than just the use of massed infantry. And this truly makes Sun Tzu a founding figure and major proponent of asymmetrical warfare. Let's move on. This period of partisan warfare, the partisan period, is important to understand too. We see large armies being the main instrument to dominate conflicts and to force a political outcome. The partisan fighter is simply the small units or bands that conduct guerrilla warfare alongside the main armies. Contextually, we need to understand this. In this time period, the standing armies were the primary instrument to achieve the state's political objective. The fact that this was recognized by governments, the fact that one country, let's say France, goes to war against England or Germany, and the battlefield was decisive, means that the standing army was decisive. The states recognized this. They recognized the outcome of the battlefield as being the sole, or I should say final, arbiter of a political dispute and determiner of political outcomes. So it's natural that the standing army would be critical, but it doesn't negate the fact that these small guerrilla bands often had extraordinary abilities to shape outcomes. We see this in the case of Juan Martín Diaz and how he was able to harass Napoleon's forces, and the result of this is extraordinary, again, as we see Napoleon defeated in Spain. So even though these small forces were secondary in the emphasis, no doubt, their outcomes necessarily and effects were not secondary. It's important to understand that. Terrorism is going to become a modern phenomenon in the 19th and 20th century. We're going to see major shifts taking place. The context to understand is that During this time period when industrialization is taking place, it's going to benefit a lot of people, but it's also going to alienate many also. And this popular discontent is going to be the context and recruitment and fertile ground for radicalism to grow out of. That coupled with the second factor, growing media, we tend to overlook this era as being one outside of this term globalization that we use, but this really is the or a beginning outflow of globalization. Growing media, the communications, the telegraph, technology is exploding in this time period where cable and telegraph and then radio and travel networks and ability to navigate the seas are certainly very positive technological outcomes that are used for an industrializing society, but are also networks and tools that can be used by these insurgent groups. And it's important to understand that. Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto should be understood in the context of this times. Not only can he effectively exploit this, the communists are able to exploit these first two factors that I'm talking about, but they're also able to galvanize so much of this discontent because of a very coherent and attractive ideology. And communism will be a very appealing ideology for many people who are very discontented. The outlet of anger, the ability to organize, the power that's involved, the personal empowerment that this kind of ideology creates, no matter how horribly unethical and ruthless in its thinking, and it certainly is. It will become the most dangerous ideology in world history, causing mass killings across the world, the horrible genocides or democide is a better term, championed by Dr. Rummel. But it's certainly a major part of what we see in this time period. We'll see terrorist groups begin to rise up and begin to organize. And most importantly, in this time period, we see a critical factor taking place. We see a major shift in targeting taking place. We see that rather than just terrorist groups and these guerrillas in the past fighting government figures and government forces, they're also going to begin to target civilian populations, the very innocent, the old, the elderly, people that are just simply attending a public gathering. Notions of collective guilt, I have here collective punishment, and the positive effects of targeting of women, children, and civilians, they state in their literature and their propaganda, becomes an incentive and becomes doctrine and starts to shape this era. Communist radicals, socialists, and anarchists and syndicalists, different terms are used in this period, will become rife in this era. And we find this in the death of President William McKinley, who's shot by an anarchist and killed. This next era is critically important. And take a look at the date here. I don't want the person listening to this video to think that communism starts in 1945. It certainly does not. That's not what's taking place here. Communism was around as an ideology long before that in various stages. As I mentioned, under Marx, it will coalesce, or I should say become more coherent and more systematized, and the organizational aspects of communism will grow. But with the defeat of the fascist forces after World War II, a political vacuum is going to take place, due in part by the defeat of fascism and the decline of the imperial powers. And this will be a period globally that will allow the Soviet Union, the chief sponsor of communism, to rise up and fill that global vacuum. So we have to understand those two important contextual developments. The decline of the imperial powers. Britain and France are simply exhausted after World War II, economically and even politically, socially. On top of this, politically meaning that the political leaders do not want to engage in another war, a major war. They don't have the political support. Society itself in many of these countries is very averse to war, and so the will and the economics and the political will simply are not there. The Soviet Union, in contrast, will have the political will have enormous resources, and be able to push these guerrilla movements globally. So we see major changes taking place. We see, rather than just a partisan era where guerrilla warfare becomes, rather is a sideshow, it becomes far more than that. It becomes the main instrument of state power for the Soviet Union, and it becomes the common battlefield and characteristic of warfare as these so-called wars of national liberation begin to emerge globally. Conflicts in Korea, conflicts in Japan that hardly got any attention, certainly full-blown insurgencies in the Philippines, those in Malaysia and elsewhere, and obviously Indochina taking place at such an increasing level in that time period, were simply the ones in East Asia and Southeast Asia, not to mention what was taking place in Africa and Latin America and in Europe. These insurgencies just explode in number and in their lethality. And a part of this is weaponization. The availability of weapons, training, sanctuary, and supply to these non-state soldiers is also going to grow exponentially in numbers and in sophistication. Arguably, and look at the balance of power shift. Rather than the state having the monopoly of power and really the source and dominance in weaponry, we find these non-state soldiers, for the very first time, having equality and even superiority in weaponry. Arguably, the AK-47 and the rocket-propelled grenade are among the most potent weapons to be used in the field, and the communist forces will use these very well. Military tactics are going to change. Mao Zedong's guerrilla warfare tactics are very sophisticated, and I urge the reader, rather the audience, to look deeper into Mao's concept of guerrilla warfare. Many of you listening to this have taken classes similar to this subject matter and understand the 3 stages that Mao proposed. A strategic survival stage where you're building your networks, you're building your capabilities, you're avoiding any type of destructive, risky, high-risk type of action with government forces that could lead to your defeat. Secrecy is critical. And then moving your forces to a position of stalemate where you expand your networks, expand your forces, expand your geographical reach, and then arguably tipping into a protracted state where you're moving to the strategic offensive and transitioning through those 3 phases. Mao not only proposed that, he lived that and developed that and was able to conquer the entire mainland of China. So the tactics that are used here are refined. They're more sophisticated. There is a very deep ideology behind it. It really is a revolution in military thought that Mao was able to propose, and it was very effective and copied internationally. It's extraordinary to note that even in the United States, that we were not without the effects or feeling the sting of this type of thinking. We overlooked the fact that the Black Panthers of the 1960s, so often looked at just as an anomaly in American history or something that's extraordinary or so different that it catches the eye. But the fact of the matter is that the Black Panthers were Maoist insurgents that were orchestrating an insurgency right in the United States through their planning, through their organization, through their propaganda. And had it not been for the security forces of the United States to break this nascent insurgency up, it could have been even more dangerous than what it was. So Mao had a tremendous influence globally. Okay, we're moving right along, and this seems like quite a bit of information, but I do want you to kind of reflect for a moment and think how this whole non-state soldier guerrilla warfare asymmetrical type movements, how they are shifting throughout history. You know, they're shifting from the various periods to the modern period where we start to see yet another change take place. There is a clear delineation in the characteristics from the communist era to the modern era. And this isn't something that's abstract for many Americans. I know I'm speaking to many service personnel, people taking these graduate military studies classes. You served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. You understand this. You understand some of the trends we're talking about and why this is so important. But let's just take a look at this slide for a minute, because this is a way to capture the modern context of non-state soldiers and some of the key aspects of it. We do want that. We want to, again, have an understanding of the capabilities, the context, and the character of these groups as a part of our introduction here through this video. This is something that is often brought out of observers of these insurgent groups. Point number one, no major preparation stage is needed for an insurgency, unlike the communist revolutions. The communist revolutions were masterful in their organization, emulated and admired even by their enemies. They often patiently worked for a decade or longer, decades in various degrees, spreading their networks, developing their procurement of weapons and supplies, globally stretching out their communication structures, infiltrating patiently and with adroit pattern and design their enemies, waiting for the development of propaganda and recruitment mechanisms, and being able to, once unleashing that, create an overall effect, kind of like pulling a tablecloth off of a table that's, where people are eating and dining. It just literally tore everything off of a society and created such a major destabilization of what was taking place. And this pre-insurgency stage was critical to communist later success, witnessed by the fact that the communists would often debate, even violently, each other on when the right time to start an insurgency after this preparation stage. We don't find this in the modern insurgencies, but let's not take that too far. We don't find a deliberate organizational stage taking place. And the reason for that is oftentimes these insurgents are already a part of local and regional networks. So we don't want to take this too far. There is a preparation that takes place in the modern age. It is not as long, it is not as calculated, but in a way it's not as artificial. When U.S. forces entered Iraq and Afghanistan and were able to fight the Taliban and prior to that fight Al-Qaeda in Iraq and similar groups, or some of these Shia extremist groups that those of us who served at USD South remember. These groups had a sophisticated structure and network, but that structure was based on their social, their family, clan and tribal connections. So we find a more natural fit of these networks in the modern era that emerge in a combative role in the modern battle space. Secondly, there's no hierarchical command structure or fixed command structure. Insurgent commanders can move about freely without remaining fixed in structure and fixed in location. And this is something that was witnessed in Iraq and Afghanistan, that we're not necessarily fighting the same group in the same area. That's very different from the rigid, hierarchical area control that the communists set up. This often makes them more difficult to locate and difficult to fight. The organization is indeed, point number three, small unit, cell activity, decentralized in operation, and no need to mobilize into large numbers and transition to a conventional army. We don't find these groups. We find these groups more likely fighting the classic war of the flea. We don't see the Taliban trying to move from small guerrilla units to larger guerrilla units to more conventional forces, then bringing in air support and then tanks. That's not to say that they couldn't or wouldn't do that later, but when fighting a superior opponent like the coalition forces, just the opposite takes place. They decentralize. They get smaller, if anything, more diffuse, spreading out their forces, and then being able to gather collectively, sometimes just when an operation takes place. So obviously they want to avoid defeat and conduct low-risk tactics, which we'll get into a little later, in order to survive. The threats are often hybrid. This is a fourth aspect of this. We don't see simply, like we did during the Vietnam War, a reliance on just the hit-and-run tactics using small arms and then later on the move to conventional forces. We find a mixture, sometimes using conventional, sometimes using asymmetrical. It varies very broadly. The use of criminal networks and expertise and criminality even to degrade the law enforcement of an area. Terrorist methods of a variety, all used together in conjunction, used even with natural and man-made disasters as force multipliers. We see a hybrid threat using a variety of tactics, techniques, and procedures that really do run across the PMISI-PT spectrum. And that, again, for most of you in the military understand that. That acronym stands for political, military, economic, social, information, intelligence, infrastructure, and PT is physical terrain and time. So we find that in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, the existence of the enemy in the battle space will involve these hybrid threats using economic warfare, using crime, using terrorist tactics at time, and then perhaps later some of the guerrilla groups swarming together in a larger formation to attack a specific point. It truly is hybrid and it's truly varied and very fluid. 5, we see a reliance on criminal, black market, social, youth, and other networks that penetrate society vertically and horizontally. So this concept of network warfare or net war is critical in understanding the modern non-state soldier. Very decentralized, very much embedded and manipulating and co-opting social networks. And lastly, as I touched on, the utilization of low-risk tactics such as improvised explosive devices and indirect fire. It's all a part of the modern non-state soldier. So what can we conclude on this basic overview of the non-state soldier? Each period, first of all, has a history that was unique in that the non-state soldier, the guerrilla, operated against established authority with varying degrees of ability, leadership, and success, an outcome determined by context, skill, and leadership. And secondly, in general, the non-state soldier has increased in capacity, operability, and effectiveness due to the access of technology, refinement of skill, and decline of the monopoly of the power held by the state. These developments, more sophisticated doctrine, more experienced in operations, thus the operability, the technological change that allows the balance of power often to tip in favor. These modern groups are now very sophisticated, not just in weaponry, but in the use of communication, social networking, tactics, as I mentioned here. It's all critical to understanding the character of these modern non-state soldiers. And lastly, common characteristics are indeed evident in all these anti-government elements. Secrecy, exploitation of terrain and the environment, reliance on the population for sanctuary, intelligence, and supply, and avoidance of direct contact with superior forces. This is a constant, this type of characteristic in all of these ages. Very important to understand. I've listed here some suggested readings, some basics as an introduction that hopefully will give you an overview of asymmetrical warfare and these non-state soldiers in particular. So please take a look at some of these. And if you're taking the Military Studies 671 non-state soldier course, we certainly will be using these as important references. Again, if you have any questions on this topic, feel free to contact me, and hopefully I'll be able to provide a clarification on that. Thank you for listening to this video lecture. I hope it provided the background and information to help you understand this topic in more depth and to be able to ultimately, in your service, to understand the contemporary operational environment with a better operability and opportunity for success. Thank you very much.